Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this latest webinar. And I'm delighted to have three very special guests on today. We have Jan Tietze, who's the field CTO for SentinelOne. And obviously, we all know the amazing things that SentinelOne are doing on a global basis. So really looking forward to getting his insights. A very special guest in Richard Pace. Richard is, I would say, a subject matter expert in human behavior and in global security, and currently working with a global pharmaceutical in BioMarin, and also British intelligence. We have our own James Bond on the call. And then Mark Brosnan, who is a technologist and co-founder and chief executive of Get Visibility, which is an AI company that helps organizations deal with data and insider risk to that data. So of all of the topics we talk about on these different webinars, I think insider threat is possibly one of the most interesting. It's a fascinating subject. And when a lot of people think about insider threat, they think about disgruntled employees, they think about IP theft, they think about sabotage, they think about espionage, they think about geopolitics, they think about Edward Snowden. But often the less sexy part of insider threat is where we go away from being malicious to being unintentional, which is definitely not as sexy. And the acronym we all often use for that in the industry is UIT, which is unintentional insider threat. And it's often a current employee, a former employee, a third party or a contractor who have access to the network, or they have access to systems within the network, and they unintentionally cause harm to the business by confidentiality or integrity or availability of systems. So it forms a fascinating debate when you look at that. And I want to maybe set the scene. I'm going to take two very high profile examples where I'm sure our listeners already know of these, but the first is Waymo, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. They're the autonomous vehicle company. They were founded by Google. Their lead engineer, a guy called Anthony Levandowski, left the company. He launched his own company. That company was bought by Google. And after Google had acquired the company, it transpired that he had taken a huge amount of intellectual property, engineering documentation, software code with him, and Google had acquired the IP that had been stolen. And the consequence of that was that there was a huge payout and none of that IP could ever get used. And the other really interesting one, I think, is Boeing. And that's probably the biggest example of a prolonged insider attack on an organization. And this spans several decades. And it's where people were specifically placed inside in the organization from, I believe it was 1979 until 2006. And their job was to steal information. They were representing Chinese intelligence. And this still to this day represents probably the greatest example of an insider threat. So it's a very complex subject. There's the high level espionage, but there's also the less salubrious unintentional threats that happen inside an organization. So I guess I'd like to maybe start off, Jan, by going to yourself. SentinelOne, you guys are recognized globally in the industry as being, subject matter experts when it comes to insider threat. And I'd like if you could maybe share your perspectives on the whole insider threat landscape with us.
I mean, it's exactly as you say, like the unintentional, or as we call it, the accidental insider is probably the most common one. It can be a phishing link that an employee clicks, can be all sorts of ways that you reach into an organization. One avenue that I personally find very interesting, because we are more focused on the technical side of things, is supply chain attacks using trusted software vendors. And we've seen a huge uptick of that over the past few years. Probably everybody is aware of the Sunburst campaign that exploited the SolarWinds supply chain. We're seeing something similar right now with a product called MOVEit, which probably some of you will have done some cleanup in your own environments by now. And that really is a problem, because an average organization has 10 or 11 suppliers, partners that they work with in this fashion, but they have a lot more software vendors. And by extension, through the software that they run in their environments, they're effectively importing users, and they're effectively giving them permissions to roam on their networks, to access resources. And very often these are not as tied down as you would wish. So I find supply chain attacks to be very interesting in this space, and I expect to see more of that over the coming years.
That's super interesting, and maybe in a moment we might come back to the concept of software bill of materials, or what we talk about in terms of SBOMs and so forth. Richard, if I jump to you for a moment, and if you'll indulge my fantasies and go to the more the sexy side of espionage, and trying to use surveillance techniques to get into organizations and so forth. In your experience, how big a problem do you believe it is to identify if an organization is challenged by, personnel on the floor of that company whose job it is to steal intellectual property, or, you know where I'm coming from? I mean,
yeah.
how are organizations equipped to identify that? And obviously there's different verticals, right? Maybe defense industrial base or high value IP manufacturing. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ronan. So I think, unfortunately, to disavow you of your fascination, for the vast majority of corporations around the world, but especially here in America where I'm based, the accidental, or in some very rare cases, the malicious insider is what most organizations will be facing. The sort of the pinnacle of the iceberg, the very, very sophisticated state-sponsored insider threat, is really only going to occur and impact a very, very small number of organizations. Where there is IP that other states or other industrial companies overseas can't acquire themselves easily and readily, you may see examples, and I'm sure it's ongoing, particularly amongst the defense organizations here. And I think the reality is that it is incredibly difficult to detect when somebody actively wants to conduct industrial espionage on an organization. And I know we'll come on and talk about this later, but it will inevitably be human error that catches that person out. It will be something that individual does that gives away that their intentions are not aligned with the organization's mission. And again, we can talk about this later, but that is why it is so important to have a fully scoped insider threat or insider risk program, which catches all of the really sort of boring, mundane stuff, due diligence around recruitment, the hiring process, the offboarding process of employees, the monitoring of employees, the data loss prevention software. It's all of those things that will build up a picture for you. In isolation, trying to deploy sort of what you might describe as being intelligence organization techniques against your workforce, it's neither culturally acceptable, it's not particularly effective. And frankly, commercial organizations, apart from a very few that are probably at the top end of defense government contracting, simply don't have either the resource, the bandwidth, or the appetite to be engaging in that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to steer you back to Netflix or Amazon Prime to get your fix on that, Ronan. The reality is, what Jan has described, and what Jan and Mark are both very focused on, is the reality for the vast majority of us focused on insider threat at the moment.
Yes. Now, I want to take what you've just said, and I want to challenge Mark on something around what you've said, right? Because we've seen in the US specifically that there's been regulatory frameworks brought in for the defense industrial base, right? And it's specifically CMMC, the cybersecurity maturity model, where if you tender to the US defense in the government, you need to be able to demonstrate a level of maturity. And I think back in, was it 2014, one of the fighter jets that the US was building, they were using several thousand contractors in the US to build the various different components that helped to manufacture that specific jet. And a few months after the jet was launched, an almost identical jet with a lot of the IP was launched in China, right? So what had obviously become very clear was that the supply chain had been compromised, and the IP that was being built across lots of different areas within the defense industrial base was compromised. And this was, I guess we often use the analogy of how do you eat an elephant? And this was done in small bites. It was done in small bites of compromise across literally thousands of companies simultaneously. So Mark, if I were to talk to you about insider threat and talk to you about data and IP, can you share maybe your perspectives on that and align it to the insider threat piece that we're talking about?
Yeah, so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to mitigate or completely insulate yourself from data leakage or data being stolen. Sometimes the task at hand can be so large that organizations don't know where to start, or mightn't even start. It becomes very overwhelming before it happens on the mind when it does happen. You see a lot of organizations now using or coming to kind of a maturity model, which is what the CMMC regulations are. It's different layers of maturity around your security, but they're also taking a risk-based approach to the data, right? So you can lock down the data, you can get to what they call zero trust, so which is put a very steel ring with trust and verify for each piece of data. But practically that's very difficult because there's lots of information you'll have in your organization that needs to be shared and needs to run the business seamlessly. So what organizations are starting to do is to really focus and identify the most risky data in that organization. So every organization will be different. For the defense industrial base, it'll obviously be classified or unclassified control documentation. For a bank, it might be personal identify information or mortgage or loan notes. For a pharmaceutical company, it could be a particular type of IP. And organizations now, rather than trying to boil the ocean, are starting to say, okay, let's put the most rigorous controls and our policies and our focus and our education around the data that, if it leaked, would be the most dangerous or damaging to us as an organization. So they're starting to build frameworks, adapt frameworks. And in the case of CMMC, adapt regulation, that's very focused on a particular type of data. And whilst it's not a silver bullet, it definitely allows organizations to be more nimble and efficient and get to that point of maximum protection for the data that matters really, really quickly, without crippling the organization in terms of putting onerous controls on all types of data.
So can you explain to me, Mark, right? So if you take Waymo, right, when Lewandowski went in, he plugged in his storage device. He took a ton of data relating to the IP, the software code. And this data is complex, right? It's not just a Word doc or a Google doc. This is in all different file formats. It's everywhere across the organization. In many cases, the ownership of specific pieces of data might have, the stewardship of that data might have rested with different people. That's an incredibly complex problem. If you look, I mean, it's one thing to implement a firewall or implement, you know, an identity access tool. It's a completely different kettle of fish to look at the value associated with a piece of data and to try and wrap that in controls. Can you elaborate maybe on the concept of that Waymo breach that we started with?
Yeah, so I think one of the complexities in having effective data loss prevention or insider threat prevention tooling was being able to understand what data was sensitive and not sensitive.
Okay.
When you think about what's actually involved in that, is it involves typically a domain expert looking at the document and understanding the context of that document and the structure of that document, and then saying, okay, yeah, this is very confidential. And up until quite recently, a lot of the understanding of that document came from pattern matching in regular expressions and lots of professional services. Again, a lot of time, effort, and energy. So it was really impossible to do that at the type of scale you'd need to understand that data. With the advent of artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of talk and chatter around large language models, which have their own risks from an insider threat perspective, by the way. But there's now technologies and capabilities that allow you to be far more contextually aware of your data, loop in your users and your domain experts in understanding that data, so you can isolate that data and then wrap the types of controls you need. So if you can isolate and understand the data, you can focus your data loss prevention or your secure web gateways or your access controls around that data a lot easier. Typically what happens when you're applying those types of protections to a blanket understanding of data is you get users knocking on your door going, hey, I can't access this and I need to send this blueprint to my third party and so on. And the business grinds to a halt, and eventually they might turn those tools off. So AI, lots of computing power, distributed computing is now allowing you to understand and focus in on that data. So in that scenario, before the data leaves, once it's left, once it's gone, it's gone. It comes down to managing the fallout from that, which is a separate topic. But in advance of that happening, a program has to be put in place in terms of identifying, locking down, mapping, and securing that data. So when it does get exfiltrated, it's either encrypted or it's maybe not available in the first place. So it's a complex approach, much easier now through better technology, but not a silver bullet, something that needs a program and time to embed.
Thank you. Yeah, Jan, can we come back to something you mentioned a moment ago, because it's obviously very prevalent right now when we talk about MOVEit. And MOVEit has been, the result of MOVEit has been profound globally, with massive corporations absolutely everywhere falling victim to very substantial attacks. And in many cases, these attacks are attacks which have resulted in what we term double extortion ransomware. They've got onto the wire, they've identified the key assets that Mark is referring to in terms of the data, and they've extracted that data. And then we get into the whole, you know, are people going to pay to not have that data published, right? But when you talk about MOVEit, I guess it's not as simple as just patching a vulnerability, right? Because lots of organizations have that capability in different areas. Some organizations have it in the cloud, some of it have it on-prem, and the vulnerability, the exploitation of that vulnerability is pretty significant. So when I think about Sentinel-1, I don't think about vulnerability management or vulnerability patching. Now, that may be the wrong assessment. So can you talk to me about Sentinel-1 and your view on MOVEit and what it is you do, you know, to help organizations who find themselves when they have high exposure to that? And then more importantly, because we're talking about insider threat, if they were late to the game in terms of hardening of their systems, what does that now look like in terms of what it is that you guys do to help?
So I'll start from the other side. I'm a little bit of a cynical person. I've been doing cybersecurity for 25 years.
You're the first cynical person I've ever met in cybersecurity, ever.
Yeah, I know. But I don't think that there's a good way to completely shield yourself from supply chain type attacks, because software today is composed of many, many different components. They come from tons of different sources. And any point in time that you look at the bill of materials, it's going to change the next release. So even if one version would be perfectly fine, if it includes some Node.js components, there will be 60,000 new lines of code introduced from 30 other projects in the next release. It's very hard to ensure that you're running trusted code, and it's impossible to prove that the code is trusted. So you can look at the one thing that all of the attackers have in common and all the actors have in common. That is, they need to act on their objective. Eventually, they need to exfiltrate, they need to destroy, they need to perform reconnaissance, they need to perform command and control. So they need to perform any of the disciplines that are needed in order to get what they're intended to get or to perform what they need to perform. And that's where we come in. So we look at telemetry of actual behaviors, and we judge that behavior both with machine learning models, AI models that run on the endpoint, as well as classical detection methods. And then additional models that we run in our cloud, where we basically collect the telemetry and can look at it after the fact. We can look at things like aggregates over time, so that you can find out that, oh, there's potential for data exfiltration because we see a difference in the traffic pattern that we see here. But the sources that you need to take into account for that are not just endpoints. There's things like endpoints that you don't control. People can bring in a Raspberry Pi and place it in your environment very easily. Your cleaners coming in at night can do that. An employee can do that. They can attach an access point. There's lots of ways to obtain technical access to an environment. That's relatively simple. So it's more than attack surface management, which you can do with vulnerability discovery and responses to that. But you also need to look for rogue devices. You need to look for different behaviors that you're not expecting. You need to look for specific behaviors that attackers will use, like encryption is one of the things that ransomware actors do. Exfiltration is one of the things that they'll do. A rogue employee will sometimes use a USB device or a computer that they bring on site in order to exfiltrate, or they will upload to a public service in the cloud. So these are different sources that you get the telemetry from to determine whether there's an attack going on or not. And of course, you don't want to do that years after the fact. So you don't want to collect it to eventually look at it once you read about your company having been breached in the news, but you probably want to know about it as it happens really quickly or as it is going on. So you need to shift left the time to detect. And that's something that we can help achieve with the technology that we have, but generally speaking, that involves looking at behaviors. And I think that's a very important component when you're trying to judge the intent of an activity that could be benign or malicious and determine what it is and whether to raise an alert or not.
So when you say behavior, are you talking about the behavior of the individual, or are you talking about the behavior of the anomalous packet that's flying across the wire?
So it's not really the packet. I mean, most of the data transfer today is encrypted anyway, so there's very little to be gained except for like metadata of the connection, which can be interesting maybe for Richard in his previous life, but in practical terms may not be as interesting. No, I'm talking about machine behaviors, which can be an expression of user behavior. I mean,
okay.
if I upload something to a site that causes machine behavior that can be observed, but we primarily judge what happens on the machine technically, and then understanding what the intention is with which this is happening.
Okay. Okay. So Richard, we're talking about behavior, right? And we're talking about, we kicked this off by saying, you know, you might be, you know, it might be sabotage, it might be espionage, or it may be that users are not educated properly, or possibly they're afraid to notify the organization if they've made a mistake, if they've clicked on a link. You know, there's lots of different behavioral aspects to problems that occur when you look at the insider threat program that an organization have. Could you share with us your view on how an organization looks at this from a behavioral standpoint? Because it is a really complex problem to get users and stakeholders bought into a framework that can be applied to an organization. And as Mark said, doing this in a way that you don't cripple the business from a productivity standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think picking up on something that Mark said that really resonated with me is that maturity model. So that maturity continuum. And I'm sure we've got people listening in on the call today, or people who will subsequently watch this after the event, who are perhaps in the position that I've been in on a number of occasions, where you're wrestling with the challenge of needing to deliver an outcome for your organization, which is, let's put it in inverted commas, an insider threat program, but then trying to work out how do you shift the organization's thinking into recognizing that that's important, getting to the end point where you have something that looks and feels like an effective insider threat program and covers all of the things we've already talked about: the malicious insider, the highly sophisticated insider, and then the accidental or the unintentional insider. And then how do you go to your organization's C-suite or board and convince them that this is something in a time of ever compressed budgets that they should be spending money on? And I think putting it into the human context is a really powerful argument. So the first argument I always make when educating people or when seeking budgetary input for an insider threat program is to highlight the reality that at some point, if you're talking about a malicious insider, at some point, an individual's interests and the organized interests are going to diverge. And there are many, many reasons why that may occur. It may be because they're feeling underwhelmed. It may be because they are having poor performance. It may be because they've had their heads turned by another job. All of these are very, very human traits. And it doesn't sound particularly sophisticated or sexy, but actually all of us have been in that position when we've thought about leaving one job and moving to the next. And so what is critical at that juncture? So if Ronan is sat there and he's thinking, I'm going to move jobs, or I'm not feeling content with my position in the organization, having the ability to both identify, detect, and report those human behaviors is critical, but also having the education and awareness that makes it very clear to you from the outset of your tenure of employment what belongs to you and what belongs to the organization. And I think to come back to one of your first questions, that's probably the biggest gray area for most companies, is how do they articulate ownership of all assets, but particularly data. And I've got lots of examples of previous organizations I've worked in where people will depart seemingly very innocuously and quite happily from the organization to take up new positions, but they've tried to take with them, in some cases, large quantities of what would be considered proprietary material. And it may be PowerPoint presentations, it may be memos, it may be meeting notes. And in the post-incident investigation, and we can come on and talk a bit about that, because having a really effective incident management function is absolutely critical to your insider threat program. But in those investigative interviews, the most common phrase you'll heard is, "I had no idea that I wasn't allowed to take this." And so that really then comes back to, well, what sort of policy and governance do you have in place? What documentation are staff being made aware of? How frequently are they being asked to review that sort of documentation? And what degree of responsibility are they carrying for understanding what belongs to them and what belongs to the organization? The simplest way to do it is to say anything that's created whilst you're working for us, anything that's stored on your working device, belongs to your organization. Now, hybrid and remote working over the last 3-4 years, and I appreciate hybrid and remote has been a thing for certain sectors for a long time, but for the vast majority of us, hybrid and remote has ushered in a completely new way of working, a completely new level of trust that an organization has to have in its employees, and has made the job of both educating those employees far more challenging, but it's also made the job of monitoring and then responding to potential cases of either data extraction or sort of more broad insider threat against IP and assets far more challenging. And I suspect both Jan and Mark have got really interesting insights and case studies around how the remote and the hybrid work can be managed from a technical perspective. But to close out on your comment about behaviors, it really does come down to having that broad cross-functional approach. And there may be people on the call today who are sat there wondering, well, how do I go about starting off building my insider threat program? And starting with that low-hanging fruit, starting with making sure that every single member of your organization knows what their responsibilities are, what they can and can't access, and how they should interact with company assets, but particularly company data. If that's all the organization has the bandwidth and the resource to do, that will put you way ahead in your journey of trying to get an effective insider threat program, because you will effectively remove the vast majority of accidental insider threats or insider risks. You will also make identified cases of insider threat far more straightforward to investigate and take whatever action your organization thinks is proportional on the back of it. When you're trying to investigate an accidental case of insider threat, one of the biggest challenges is, well, what can we actually do to either punish this person, to recover the data, to try and do something that makes the organization feel better about what they've experienced. And if education and awareness hasn't underpinned the program or the approach that you're taking, the reality is there is very little that you can do, and there is very little that you can fall back on.
Wow. That is definitely, there is a lot to unpack on what you just presented, right? So I want to ask a question about what you just spoke about, because I mean, you delivered that extremely eloquently. But I want to give a scenario. I want to do a round table on this. I'm going to start with Mark, and then we're going to go to Jan, and then back to you, right? I have never seen, I'm doing this 20 years. I'm doing it as long as you, Jan. I look older, but I'm doing it as long, if not longer, right? I've never seen a company ever, anywhere, in any part of the world, in any industry, where the cyber team are not overstretched, overworked, and under-resourced. And I often, and I say this probably on every webinar, I often, when I talk about governance, risk and compliance and frameworks and cybersecurity, I use a political analogy. I'm not politically affiliated, but we've got the virtue signaling left who are saying to us, you need to do this and you need to implement that and you need to do all of this better, and we need to demonstrate compliance with GDPR and CMMC and TISAX and GDPR and everything else. And then on the right, we've got these guys running around with their hair on fire, trying to stop, their IP being stolen and dealing with, patching and MOVEit vulnerabilities and ransomware. And while they're putting in really good technology like Sentinel-1 and Get Visibility and other tools, there's lots of different tools at lots of different points within their organization. And what I see, and I'm going to come to you now, Mark, to maybe give some clarity on this, is I often see that there's a disconnect between the left and the right, as you could say there is in politics, where you will have the virtue signaling piece and you'll have the overworked, under-resourced engineering technical delivery piece. And that ownership piece, unless they maybe have someone like you, Richard, who can come in and really put structure to this, and a lot of companies won't have the budget, to get MI5 guys to come in and get their house in order, and it tends to fall into a delta somewhere in the middle. So, Mark, if you could maybe talk a little bit about my observations, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, and then we'll maybe circle back to Richard. You guys take the floor.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's two key stakeholders there with cybersecurity, who are in charge of securing the network and securing the data that's in that network and so on. But it's all kind of lumped under one kind of view. You've got the governance people who need to make sure it's in line with compliance, and that has an element of data security, but it's got a lot of other use cases as well. There's a third leg to that stool, though, Ronan, that sometimes gets neglected, and kind of it's coming back to Richard's point, is the business itself that use the data and utilize the data are a key stakeholder in that as well, right? So if the security team to optimize what they're doing would lock down access to everything, the governance people would make sure things are in line with policy, and that'll make life very difficult for the business people who are effectively asked to deal with the data on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately,
does this thing go into the too hard to do bucket?
It's too hard to get done quickly, but there's a lot of quick and easy wins that you can do. And the first one of those is alignment, right? So it's all a tabletop theoretical exercise.
Can you give us a real world example? Don't name any customers, but give us a real world example of this problem and how you get to an outcome.
So we were engaged with a very large client, and they had a cybersecurity team with a very clear mandate around protection and DLP, and you did a different set of mandates and different set of regulations for the governance team. And when we were trying to find alignment around the data and how to define it and how to educate people on it, it was very theoretical. There was lots of different people talking about the same thing, but in a different language and not resonating. And the best way to do that is actually to deal with real world examples and their real world data, and to put in front of them a picture of what their data is, where it's currently situated, what their current, say, posture is like, and use that then to find alignment. And then to relate that back to risks that are associated with that. Well, this pocket of really valuable IP happens to be in a shared drive that is accessible by 70% of the organization. And there's another set of data over here that's an exact duplicate set that nobody seems to have access to or knowledge of. And all of a sudden then a conversation around the alignment and definition of what that IP actually is. And that starts then to put the program in place. And it always starts with identifying and isolating the data that's at most risk to that organization. And slowly you start to get wins in, and it's very easy to communicate back to the organization. One other thing that we've found very effective is to layer in suggestions into the everyday workflow. So the education is difficult when you're taking people out of their normal cadence, their normal workflow and process. It's an extra overhead for, say, a marketing department or a sales department or finance department. You really need to layer in the education on a day-to-day, task-by-task level without being overly intrusive. So what we've seen work really well is with every piece of data or every file that's touched, for the AI to give a suggestion saying, hey, by the way, we're not doing anything here. We're just letting you know that this is confidential information, or this really looks like IP based on what our stakeholders are saying. And then the stakeholders, through the course of sending an email or saving a Word document or editing or creating a PDF or PowerPoint, or begin to say, okay, oh, the company is telling me that this is confidential or this is IP. And it serves two purposes. Number one, it stops people from making silly mistakes. But secondly, it ingrains into the subconscious that these documents, there is an understanding of these documents and they are valued and they have an understanding. And we find at the end of that process, then over a couple of months, without any additional training, the organization is far more subconsciously aware of what that data is. So when you come back to that initial set of 3 stakeholders, it's easy then to have the conversation because everybody's seen it and said, well, actually, twice this month, I nearly sent my entire payroll or staff to the wrong person and it stopped me. This is a really important area that we need to concentrate and lock down and put around our DLP, right? So it's slowly introducing it without having too much friction. And then that level of education allows for really constructive plans to be put in place and executed around long-term data security.
Wow, fantastic. Yeah, and I know now we're talking about, the same question, right? But we're talking about behavior, we're talking about data, and then, so what's your perspective on this?
So I'm not sure I can offer much of a perspective on this point specifically. I really love Richard's take on ensuring that people know what's expected of them. If you expect a certain type of behavior, then they need to understand what that is. That also has the added benefit of allowing you to investigate, making it easier to legally follow up. Like policies and procedures don't exist if people don't know what they are and if they don't live them. And I just remembered a few years ago, I was part of a very large tech company, and we had a really good insider threat program that also used a practical element to overcome the social stigma of doing things like reporting an incident and the stigma of doing things like not holding a door open for someone that's tailgating through that entrance, or just not letting everybody in that's just wearing a helmet and a yellow vest and a clipboard. And you'd be surprised how far these people can get in an organization. Usually they have free access to large parts of a campus. And they hired an outside consultancy that acted as an adversary and basically threw the gauntlet to employees. And every week there would be a new challenge. So week 1 was exploiting unlocked Windows workstations. So people would start getting into the habit of locking their workstations. And then they would add challenges on top, like phishing emails, tailgating as they were entering into buildings, doing physical security challenges, placing USB thumb drives with interesting files on them that would phone back to the provider in meeting rooms and cafeterias. And because this was over half a year, this created a shift in culture, and it was suddenly very acceptable to not just hold the door open for the next person that comes unless they show proof of badge, and people started showing their badge more, etc. And that was very helpful in transforming that culture for a company that had more than 90,000 employees. So I can strongly recommend investing in your people this way.
But yeah, and that's a great answer. But there was another part to the question I'd like you to maybe think about, right? I'm a large hospital. I'm overstretched. I'm under-resourced. I have too many agents. I have too much technology sprawl. I've got too much shelfware. What is it that a very sophisticated EDR tool like a Sentinel-1? I know there can be a huge, I don't need a massive answer to this, but why is it that the type of technology you guys are building helps to alleviate that skills shortage or resource shortage that we may have as an organization? What's different in terms of what it is you guys do?
So a lot of the solutions that exploit AI and ML and embrace that as a new technology that has become available over the last 10 years, where the foundations are really 60 years old, but now we have more democratized access to the kind of compute that's needed in order to build those models, is that you can automate more of the tier 1 analyst work. So you can have, and that's one of the things that we do, you can make decisions in real time on the endpoint where an activity is happening, and be disruptive, not just detect it so that you can detect and respond after the fact, but do that immediately. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is more technical, and there are actions that attackers do, like ransomware, where you encrypt or destroy files. So one of the technologies that we have will ensure that you can roll back these attacker actions, whether it is obtained persistence, whether it is that they have destroyed data. So it can help you get into a trusted state really quickly, and you can do that at scale for thousands of devices at a time. It doesn't require data transfer. All of that is on the endpoint. So that really helps you to respond at scale to these kinds of incidents. And that's extremely useful when you are in a situation that you really don't want to be in.
That's a good answer. Thank you. So we've gone around, Richard, and I want to come back to you on that point, right? And it is, bringing a guy like you in the middle who understands this. It's the way your brain is wired. It's very effective for a global leading pharmaceutical to have a guy like you. But what if they don't have a Richard Pace? How do you align overstretched, overworked, under-resourced security and a GRC team on the left, and how do you knit together some sort of insider threat program? And we have a question here from Cutillo, which is, how do you handle situations where there is a conflict between security best practice and compliance requirements? So I'm hitting you with a lot there now, Richard.
Okay. No, that's fine. Maybe if I answer the first one first. So I would say take a cross-functional approach. If you're an organization that is scarce on resources but still wants to try and do something about this, absolutely get, and I would build on the list of stakeholders that Mark alluded to, people from your HR team, from your legal team. There's a very good chance that if your organization has any degree of maturity, there's actually lots of components of an insider threat program already in existence. What you don't need anybody with security background. You need somebody who's able to be an ambassador for that program, to articulate it clearly to budget holders, and then harmonize those efforts that are already in existence. So whether that's working with your HR team to look at how it is that people are onboarded and offboarded, where are the thresholds of concern when you're having performance review conversations? If someone is displaying behaviors that causes the organization concern, is there a mechanism for those to be escalated to a cross-functional group to look at that can then task out scarce resource from your cyber team, perhaps to include some enhanced monitoring, perhaps to put them under on a watch list for a period of time? But it really does come back to taking a cross-functional effort, because I'm convinced, having seen it in the real world, actually there's a significant amount of program components already in existence in most organizations. It's about finding an effective way of bringing those together.
So are you saying, if I was to dissect that a lot of this is actually common sense if you align your existing investments effectively?
I don't know that it's common sense. I think the approach of working outside of silos and swim lanes is absolutely common sense. And I've been struck by the number of American companies, particularly, that have incredibly talented, capable people, but working in a very siloed fashion and not talking to other people who have a vested interest in defending the organization against an insider threat, because perhaps they don't see it naturally as being part of their day-to-day. And
Yes.
That may include HR, that may include legal. It's not just the cyber team or the global security team or the legal team that have that responsibility. It's everybody. It's your team responsible for onboarding. It's your talent and training team. And actually, if you bring those people together, you can then have a really good, even if it is a basic, but still a really good program that escalates concerns and manages those concerns as and when they see them. And then when you start to wrap in all the technology that we've talked about today, suddenly you're so much greater than the sum of your parts.
Wow. Yeah, what's becoming very clear to me in this discussion is that the human element and the behavior element of this is such a foundational piece. Guys, the question that came in, can I throw it open to the floor, whoever wants to give their opinion? How do you handle situations where there is a conflict between security best practice and compliance requirements? Anybody?
Well, I can have a go at that, albeit not from if we're talking about security in the general terms rather than specifically cyber security. The easiest answer for me is, what is it that the business wants and needs? And to my mind, security best practice is a great catchphrase, but security best practice is irrelevant if it's not doing the job that your organization needs it to do. So if you are not being compliant with a law or a regulation, but you are following security best practice, you are immediately undermining the integrity and the effectiveness of your organization. So again, cross-functional working, again, coming together and discussing that, but you have to be compliant, and then making sure that your security function works to that compliance objective or to that compliance model would be what I would be recommending to whoever asked the question on our audience.
Anybody else want to add to that? Jan, can I ask you if you know, you guys have a high value client and they, you know, they don't want specific functions within the SentinelOne suite enabled. Is it a risk question? Is it a risk tolerance question? Is it a risk appetite question? I mean, what's your view?
So I understand the question as more like when there's a mismatch between what you should be doing, what's right from a security perspective, and what the compliance audit demands. I can give a practical example. In the space of anti-malware, which is not a super exciting space, but in that space, we've seen a change in the detection methods going more towards AI and ML and evaluating code before it executes versus doing pattern matching that requires weekly or daily signature updates. And everyone's probably familiar with that. But there's a lot of compliance regulation. There's PCI DSS that require that you do a regular full scan to accommodate new signatures so that you can detect the latest threats. So if you were following that and using signature-based scans, you would effectively be lowering your security posture, not really what you intend to do. And what has worked for me is talking to the auditor, explaining it and discussing it and getting to a solution. We can still do weekly scans, but we're not going to adopt signatures because that would mean compromising on security.
Excellent. I appreciate that. A good answer. So Mark, I want to jump over to you for a moment, right? We're talking, we've skirted around the issue of AI and ML and so forth, right? And obviously in Get Visibility, it's, you know, you guys are building cutting edge AI, ML models, narrow models, LLMs. And in my mind, if an organization isn't benefiting from the capabilities that the LLMs present in different departments, such as marketing or maybe security intelligence, it's a missed opportunity. But I think what we've also seen is that these LLMs present, it's almost like a forbidden fruit, right? In terms of uploading code and sharing sensitive information. So I'd like to maybe open it up to the floor, Mark, if you want to maybe share your perspective first, maybe talk about how you're delivering AI and ML to customers from a data perspective, but also what risks you see with the adoption of this technology on a wholesale basis.
Yeah, I suppose this is a perfect example of where different data has different meanings and different risks to the organization. So you could say, yeah, we're going to ban ChatGPT or Bard or whatever, and the marketing department can't create copy, or we can't start to put proposals together. And that mightn't have any sensitive information. So immediately you're turning around to your organization and saying, no, actually, you can't use it. We're going to put you at a competitive disadvantage to all of your other competitors who are using it for, you know, code quality or code QA. And then on the other hand, we're seeing really practical examples of really valuable IP, whether it be source code or personally identifiable information or medical records, actually going to ChatGPT, and that now becoming available in lots of places where it shouldn't, and start to become reflected in data that's available to everybody. And to strike that proper balance between optimizing your efficiency and at the same time really securing what's important to you, you have to understand what's going there in the first place. So the extreme approach is ban the access to large language models and generative AI. And the other extreme, you have open access. What we're doing is we're kind of sitting in the middle. So we're using what we call narrow models that can operate quite effectively and efficiently, that don't need to solve or understand all of the text, but need to be able to identify what's there and can stop that information leaking out of the organization. Or in some cases, where it's information that has yet to have a decision around what the policy is, create alerts and an understanding of what's going there. So you're effectively using very specific focused AI, or that's what we're doing, to stop the egress of information to ChatGPT. And if that's done, again, keeping all the stakeholders in mind with a good understanding of the data, that's quite possible. It's very early in its stages. Lots of organizations are blind to the risks of it, if I'm being honest, at the moment.
Mark, just one question. So how would you protect IP such as source code from being shared in a public forum or through an application like GitHub? So that's an example, I guess, of what back to the start.
Yeah. So you can't just plug in something and it's going to understand your data immediately. But if you're building an understanding of your data and building models for your data over the course of a period of a month or two, in terms of sitting on and watching the data and classifying and getting some user feedback, all of a sudden now you've got a model that understands. So you use an organization's own data with their own users giving feedback in the course of their day-to-day when they're saving or compiling a document. That's creating the understanding of the narrow AI model. So when it sees that same type of pattern or code or mathematical view of that data, again, before it gets blocked and flagged essentially.
Jan, in terms of AI and its adoption within the walls of the enterprise, what's your view?
So we've been doing that for a while to analyze code. So before it executes and to build behavioral models. The large language models are very interesting from two perspectives. One is they can make our lives as defenders easier, because threat hunting is a very complex task and it's difficult to write the right queries. We presented at RSA conference what's called Purple AI, which is a large language model that takes human language, natural language input, and then performs the translation into the hunting query languages for you. So you can ask things like, am I being targeted by Club ransomware group? Or you can ask, show me all the processes that have less than 10 invocations in the past 2 weeks and that were launched by a Microsoft Office application. So that will turn those into queries that you can then analyze the results further and interact with in natural language. So that's really useful on the defensive side. And of course, as you implement it, you need to look at the same kinds of data confidentiality challenges that Mark just mentioned, so that you don't accidentally expose anything to outside. So we need to have fully self-contained models that completely run in our software. And then the other aspect is there are attacks using it. You can coerce ChatGPT into writing a ransomware for you. You just need to pose as a security researcher, so you need to be smart in how you prompt it, but it will eventually recombine all of the code snippets that it finds to create a piece of ransomware for you. And that's an interesting challenge, because it may mean that, similar to what Microsoft's doing with Copilot, that attacker source code may evolve more quickly than it has in the past, and we need to respond to that.
Very interesting. And I saw that launch at RSA, and yeah, it's super interesting what you guys are doing. Richard, do you have a perspective on the use of ChatGPT? I mean, you're in the valley, you're in the heart of all of the activity that's taking place in AI. Do you have a view in terms of how corporations should use it? Obviously, I mean, it drives a lot of productivity, but it obviously there's the potential for risk as well.
Yeah, I think looking at AI as a non-cyber and a non-IT practitioner, it is both sort of awe-inspiring but also slightly scary. And I think one of the biggest challenges that organizations will face is that there will be a very small number of people within their companies who truly understand the power and the risks. And I would include myself in that. I will have people coming to me in my organization asking me about, what should we do with the advent of AI? And the reality is that people like me and lots across corporations simply don't know. It is people like Jan and people like Mark, but it is a very, very small number of people who at the moment could truly make accurate or even close to accurate predictions on what AI will mean for insider threat and for the attacks that we face. Mark actually, I think, summed it up perfectly earlier when he talked about that spectrum of activity. On one hand, you have the lock everything down, the sort of zero trust, and at the other end of the spectrum. And I would encourage every organization to probably be slightly right of center until they have people who can truly explain to them what AI means, but getting an understanding and getting an understanding from an external organization is probably the most valuable thing that somebody in my position could do right now. So you can at least go to your stakeholders with a slightly more educated version of, I simply don't know, but we do need to be cautious.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. We're coming up on the hour. I feel like this could easily go for another hour. But so Mark, in the last couple of minutes we have, can you share with me what is the advantage of an organization using a large language model versus using a narrow language model, or versus using a mixture of both? Because I know you're building LLMs, SentinelOne are building LLMs. You're doing custom narrow models for deployment. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I think understanding.
And by the way, because this is insider threat, if you could maybe give a use case of how this can be applicable from an insider threat perspective to an organization.
Yeah, I think spending time understanding how AI works and is applicable first is really valuable for an organization. And there's lots of companies who are doing it will give you strong education on that. There's a big value in terms of time, total cost of ownership, but the ability to do functions and implement features that were not possible before, right? So that's important. Large language models are effectively billion parameter models that can process all kinds of text and infer lots of different types of meaning and generate a lot of content or output from that. And that's very, very valuable, but it can also be costly. Costly to either host yourself if you don't want that information going out, or costly if you're using a third party. And there's a risk with that information leaving your organization as well. Narrow language models are models that are effectively tailored to much smaller parameters. So they're far more focused on understanding a very specific problem set, and they can get reinforced learning. They're not as powerful, but again, they're focused. And for a lot of the type of value you get for data security in particular, it doesn't need to be able to write a poem about the content you've just given it. It just needs to know if it's a security threat, or be able to track the type of user behavior analyst. So what you need is something that's effective, efficient. Theoretically, you really want your AI models to be running on the endpoint or on your own hardware where possible, but you don't want to be creating a huge overhead. So you need just enough in terms of sizing for your AI. So you need to be highly effective, highly efficient, low cost of ownership, or low processing cost, and very little security risk. And that's where large language models would differ from maybe the more narrow specific models. Large language models, what we find and what we're using is our large language models are helping train our narrow models much quicker. So we're going to organizations and we create a narrow model to understand a specific piece of IP. Large language models can help us train up those models much, much quicker, right? So we're starting to be able to utilize the large language models to have very effective, tailored AI for that organization.
Wow. Jan, in terms of Purple, in terms of your LLM that you guys are building in SentinelOne, how much better does that capability make you guys at doing what you do?
It's difficult to quantify, and as you know, I'm a bit cynical, so I'm not going to say any numbers. But it makes a big difference in terms of the time it takes to perform a query when you threat hunt, because you need to spend a lot less time translating your own thoughts into an artificial language that doesn't come out naturally, and it reduces the barrier of entry a lot for more junior analysts that are able to articulate what they need and what they need to find and what they're searching. But they're not really able yet to articulate the how, or the exact details of how a grouping operation works, or how you narrow a result set down. So it just makes these much more productive. And going back to your earlier statement about the problem of cybersecurity being understaffed, under-resourced, that's definitely true for many organizations in their SOC. You hire a tier 1 analyst, that's not the job they want for their life. So yes. Eventually you will lose them. That's a good case for managed detection and response services in general, and one of the reasons why people choose them, because they solve the bench problem. And I think we're making it more accessible for younger analysts, for more analysts to enter into that space this way and to become more effective for the senior ones. So that I think is the value. It makes it more accessible for all.
Fantastic. Guys, on that note, can I, Jan, Richard, Mark, I think that was absolutely outstanding content. I really enjoyed the discussion. I mean, we've covered a lot in an hour, from governance, policy, resources, AI, LLMs, narrow models, incredible insights on behavior, and definitely one of the most enjoyable webinars I've done. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.